Hello, art historians, and welcome to our first of two lectures where we're going to start looking at the art of the Arabic Islamic Empire. So, in our last lectures, we started looking at the art of the Islamic world, and we really talked about how the beliefs of Islam really influence the way that the art and architecture appears early on. So, we looked at the Kaaba, which is the holiest site in Islam. We looked at the Dome of the Rock. We looked at the design of different mosques, which no matter where they are in the world, even though they may take on the regional characteristics, are still going to have the same features. So now we're going to start to look at what happens when Islam moves out to not only Arabic people expanding it and taking it with them through trade or through conquest. We're going to look at what happens when other groups adopt Islam. So, for example, the Turks and in Persia, and no matter how it is that they come to embrace it, they're going to see a mix of those areas with the beliefs of Islam included. So one of the things that's going to happen after the death of Muhammad is that, just to provide a little bit of context, is that he hadn't really designated a successor. So you're going to see the people that come after him become known as the Caliphs, all right, or the successors of Muhammad. And when Muhammad died, the unity of the Ummah, or the Islamic community under all these different Arabic tribes, was really starting to threaten to fall apart. So expanding outside of Arabia within this kind of Islamic empire of faith really became a way to unite these people together under a common mission. So we're going to see Islam spread outside of Arabia in a couple different ways. Conquest, which means they actually conquered the areas nearby, like parts of the Byzantine Empire and Persia, through conversion of people who willingly decided to convert because of all the benefits of converting to Islam, and through trade, because Muhammad was a merchant. And, one of the reasons for the development of Sharia law was because in these areas, it was kind of lawless. Like, it was the land of the wild, wild west, basically speaking. And Sharia law could really serve to kind of create ethical rules and guidelines for business dealings at the time. So we are going to see a great deal of Islam spread as a result of commerce as well, and through trade. So just to give you guys kind of an idea of what we're looking at, the green here is the area that started out as the original Ummah, so the uniting together of all of those tribes in Saudi Arabia together, united under Islam. And you can see up to the north, you have the Sassanid Persian Empire, and you have the Byzantine Empire above it. And the Islamic Empire is actually going to conquer those areas and move all the way into Spain, and move that direction. So everywhere that this spread, the Islamic faith is going to spread with it. And naturally, that's going to impact the art. We've already seen that with the Mosque of Cordoba, and we saw that with the Mosque of Isfahan. Isfahan being more of the Iwan style mosque, where in the Byzantine Empire area, it's going to be the centrally designed mosque, and in the hypostyle style more over in the areas that used to be controlled by Rome. So the largest empire that's going to be created under the Islamic world is going to be under the Umayyad Caliphate. The Umayyads were a family who became the caliphs, or the successors or rulers over this empire. And by this point, being a caliph basically means that you were an emperor. So they are going to spread all the way out to this area. They're much more militant in nature and spreading out. And again, these are the ones who beat the Byzantines. They're the ones who beat the Persians and make it all the way into Spain. And again, it's going to spread very quickly because, number one, you have a religiously motivated military that's fighting for a higher purpose, and conversion to Islam came with a whole lot of benefits because they brought with them a great deal of wealth. And if you wanted to tap into that, a really good way to do it was to make sure that you had that money. So by not having to pay a tax for not converting, that made life a little bit easier. So eventually what's going to happen is, over time, being the caliph starts to become more of a political thing than it does really a religious thing. So the first four caliphs after Muhammad, those are the ones who have their names in the Hagia Sophia, were called the rightly guided caliphs because they were doing it for what they considered to be the right reasons. But as the empire became bigger, to be a caliph, really meant to be an emperor. So you wanted the trappings and the image that came with being an emperor. So what we start to see happen is that the emperors start to, there starts to be a competition over who would not only be caliph, but it becomes a dynasty. Like the Umayyads were a caliphate that was a dynasty. So the Abbasids come in and conquer the Umayyads and actually tried to wipe out every member of the Umayyad family so that the descendants, couldn't keep going on. And the Umayyads are actually going to retreat all the way to Spain. and kind of set up their own caliphate separately there. So the Abbasids are going to move the capital of the caliphate, or this empire, to Baghdad. And the Abbasids are kind of like, you typically have a military rule, kind of like with Tang China, and then you have one that's more intellectually focused, like Song China. And the Abbasids are going to be the opposite, because if the Umayyads had been so militaristic, the Abbasids are not going to be like that. But by moving their capital to Baghdad, where they set up these great centers of learning called the House of Wisdom, they were very big into studying Greek and Roman texts, medicine, science, very, very advanced culture. The closer they got to Persia, they started to admire the Sassanid Persian kings. And eventually they will take over this area and spread Islam into Persia, or what is today Iran. But they started to admire the way that the Persian kings lived, very decadent, wearing a lot of purple, having a lot of stuff. And that started to kind of become a problem for the people of the Islamic Empire, especially people who had really liked the Umayyads, because they were kind of defying what the whole idea of Islam was about. It wasn't about material wealth necessarily as it was charity, and they didn't feel that they were truly the rightly guided caliphs. Now, we're also going to see inside this area a fight start to break out between two different groups of Islam, like the Sunnis and the Shia Muslims. And the Sunnis had an entirely different view of who could be the caliph than the Shia did. And this is kind of an important part of this. The Sunni believed that any good Muslim could be the caliph, where Shia believed that it needed to be a descendant of Muhammad. And to this day, the Shia are the minority. They make up about 5% of all Muslims. And to be honest, the disagreements between them today are not really so much religious. There are some issues there, but really it's kind of like the difference between Catholic and Protestant, where it's not really that big of an issue, but it is a political issue, because your religion was also your politics. So your allegiance to one or the other could define what nation or state that you were loyal to. And this is still causing problems in the Middle East today as a result of that, because of arbitrary borders that have been drawn. So, for example, in Syria, you have a Shia leader who is not very nice to the Sunni population, and there's a civil war that has been continually going on in that country, and Iran supports Syria because Iran is a predominantly Shia country, which we will talk about, and they feel isolated because they are surrounded by Sunni Muslims in Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. So there's a lot of hostility in Iran with the other parts of the Middle East, so which they wouldn't consider themselves Middle East, nor do they consider themselves Arabic. They consider themselves to be Persian in descent. So what we're eventually going to see happen over time is the Abbasid Caliphate, which is an empire at this point, is going to collapse, and we're going to see different little caliphates pop up in different areas. Some of them are going to also be called sultanates, which is you basically have a sultan who is not a ruler because he's Muslim, he just happens to be an Islamic ruler over an Islamic country, or emirates, which is kind of the same thing. So you can kind of see here, this is the expanse of the Islamic Empire, and you can see it takes over the Persian Empire and it starts moving towards India, all of Saudi Arabia, across North Africa. And there's a reason for that, because they would only cross the Sahara Desert to go trade, because they didn't have the ability. The camels that could cross the Sahara Desert would basically drop dead when they got to the other side of the Sahara. So they had to rely on the native peoples of Africa on the other side to basically do the trade for them. So let's look at this piece right here. This is obviously a luxury good, and it's very small. It's not very big. It's actually kind of the size of like a perfume container, if you will. But looking at this, you could probably identify right off the bat that there are some things on here that are very Islamic. You can see the calligraphy around the band. You can see it is carved from ivory, which would have come from Africa, because the Islamic world would have had a great deal of trade with North Africa since they controlled the northern part of it, although they probably got access to the ivory from trading with West Africa. You can see the vegetative patterns. You can see a great deal of arabesques and tessellation, but if you're looking very closely, you may also notice that in addition to the animals, there are also figures. There are people carved into this, which we already talked about the fact that in the Islamic world, you don't show figural art. So why is it okay on this particular item, which is clearly a luxury item and it was a gift? Why is it okay for them to show figures on this? This is actually called the Pyxis of Al-Mughira, and a pyxis is kind of like a perfume container, and it was actually a gift to a royal family member of the Islamic Moors. So this is the family that was ruling Spain, basically until the Muslims got kicked out of Spain. When Ferdinand and Isabella, the same ones who will sponsor Columbus in the 1490s, they reconquered Spain for the Christian world after they, couldn't basically win back the land during the Crusades. So what had happened here is the Umayyad family, remember the first true dynasty that was, the rulers of the Caliphate, they had run away and established a new caliphate and family here in Spain. And one of those groups was the Moors, who had traveled into this area. And this was actually a gift for a prince who had reached the age of maturity. So it was a luxury item. And of course, being a prince, they want to show their wealth and their power. So an item like this made of ivory would have been sufficient to do that. All right. So here is why you can actually see that it's okay. And there you can see the size of it. Why it is okay for them to show figural images such as animals and even more importantly, people in this actual work of art. So we know it's Islamic because it does have the Arabic calligraphy on there, and it was part of the Islamic world whenever it was made, one of the Caliphs. So there are 8 medallions around this carved into it, and it was deliberately made for this prince because it shows things that the royal court would like to do. So hunting animals, playing sports, playing music, things that are of leisure to a royal family. We can see, like I said, the floral patterns, which are very important for like the idea of the gardens of paradise and the floral motifs. But why the people? Well, it's okay because this is not a religious work of art. It was a secular work of art. So therefore, it was okay for them to show the people in this one. So you can see here at the top of it, and then carved around it, there's a person right there sitting on horseback, doing things like hunting and being around beasts. There's birds of hunting that they would find. And then God's blessings, favors, joy, beatitude to Al-Mughira, son of the commander of the faithful. May God have mercy upon him. So you can kind of see that. And it's supposed to be 1357. Sorry about that. That was a typo. 357, Islam wasn't even around. All right. So there is a very passive aggressive message in this particular work of art that the Umayyads are kind of throwing shade, and no pun intended, because they're actually sitting under the shade of a date tree on this. They're throwing some shade at the Abbasids, who were now ruling from far away in Baghdad. So the Pyxis actually shows a great deal of lions killing bulls, and I will kind of go back to this. And if you remember anything, the Abbasids really liked the Persians, and the Persians were very into bulls. And we know that because in Persepolis, they had the great capitals holding up like with the bulls, basically, at the very top of it. So that was something there. And you can see here, there's a lot of lions eating bulls. And the whole reason for that is because basically the lions are the Umayyads, like showing that they were actually the true victors in this nature. There's an Umayyad ruler who is on here being fanned by an Abbasid ruler, so kind of to show their status. But one of the really sad ones is this one that's right here. And you have Umayyad rulers who are picking dates off of a tree. And you can see them grabbing the dates because the detail is so exquisite. And dates would have only been available to them in the eastern lands that they had lost to the Abbasids. So basically showing, their anger about this overthrow. And here you can see an Umayyad ruler who is being fanned by the Abbasids, who aren't really big fans of that. And they're sitting on top of bulls to kind of show that the Umayyads stand on top of the bulls. They're really they're the ones in power. So also in Spain, because remember, in Spain, we're going to see the Islamic world sitting very, very close to the Christian world. And you're going to see the creation of the Alhambra, which the Alhambra actually began as a fortress / palace. All right, so it was a fortified palace sitting very, very high on top of an acropolis, which was a way for them to kind of defend themselves against invasions from other Islamic groups or also from the Christian world, which was nearby. And it's built by the Nasrid Sultan, so this family that kind of takes over ruling Spain, who were of Moorish descent, and the Moors had actually come in from North Africa. There is 1 mile of walls that are around this, and it's actually 3 different palaces. And because They did build this in Spain, which would have originally been part of the Roman Empire. There are going to be elements of this that do very much look on the exterior, particularly like it is part of the Islamic world. But the interior of it definitely reflects that idea of Islamic faith and the fact that this was an Islamic development, that this was part of the Islamic Empire or part of this family. Eventually, Ferdinand and Isabella, whenever they take over Spain and they reconquer it for the Reconquista, are going to raise their children here. And Catherine of Aragon, who was the first wife of Henry VIII, so Henry VIII of England is going to be around during this time. Catherine was the baby daughter of the daughters in this family, and when she went to marry first Arthur and then eventually Henry because Arthur dies, she would tell them stories about growing up in the Alhambra because and wearing kind of like the Islamic type of clothing or the Arabic type of clothing, and she just fascinated people with those stories. And in the Islamic world, women were more of a voice. They actually had more rights than other places in the world. So she was raised kind of that way, and her mother were forces to be, reckoned with. So this is actually the ground plan of the Alhambra, and you can see that it was added on to over time, all right? And you kind of can see that different, groups will add on to this as it expands. All right, so let's take a real quick look at this. Okay, so they did a really, really good job on that video and explaining it as well as I ever could of the fact that this really does combine, and it was added on to. So you saw the Palace of Charles V, who was actually the nephew of Catherine of Aragon. So he was definitely a Christian ruler trying to add on his own palace in here, which definitely would have had a different look. But they talk about how everything in it is very nature based. And so to the Islamic world, nature was a very important part of this. And that idea of the gardens of paradise and this relationship with nature. So the mukarabas that hang down, like the stalactites and the honeycomb Mocharnis type of roof, all right? So it's something that would definitely stand out. And then we saw all of the different gardens and reflecting pools that all have these different functions. So again, I'm just going to go through this lightly because they already mentioned quite a bit of this in the video, but only God is the victor is through it repeatedly in calligraphy, which would have been the motto of this dynasty, being very Islamic. So what's really kind of cool about this is every part of this palace could have been blocked off in case there was an attack to protect the people. And you even saw how in some of the buildings they had tricks to kind of fool people who might be invading. The fountains and the water sources could be cooling but also warming because they can absorb the water that's in it. And then a couple of the major ones that they focus on that are very popular are the Court of the Lions, which does spit the water into the different pools because those would reflect the four gardens or the four rivers of paradise. So there's the gardens and then there's the rivers. And then the very large amounts of floral motifs through it. And you did notice that in one of the rooms, it did have images of the kings, which would have been okay because those aren't Islamic or they're not religious leaders. So you can see here, I'm in this much more intimate area. And of course, you wouldn't want your visitors to see kind of a Christian, European influence here. But there was a relationship between one of the rulers and Pedro the Cruel of Portugal, who would have had Christian style architecture. So you see that implemented in here, almost like an atrium that you would see in either a monastery or that you would have seen in a Roman villa. And there's the Court of the Lions, who would spit the water into those different pools that would reflect the four rivers. So this is, again, the Hall of the Two Sisters, which is that Mocharnis Dome. And the longest time there was a story that it was for two sisters who had been murdered, but that actually wasn't the case. It was actually because of the two huge marble slabs that are there. And remember, they wanted this to also be an embassy to impress people who came in. So you have in this dome, you've got the windows around the front that reflect light from all different angles off the different angles of those Mocharnis domes, the honeycomb domes, and then the mukarabras that are hanging down, as you can see here, that look like the stalactites. So again, why embrace the nature? Because it almost reinforces that natural idea of rule, that this is natural, this is, we're supposed to be here, we are part of this. The video just kind of shows what the other ones do. All right, so we are going to stop there. And then we are going to move on to where we can see that Islamic influence outside of Spain and moving back towards the eastern side of what used to be the empire.